Thanks very much. Good morning. Thanks very much for coming. So today we're presenting the 16th assessment report from IFAC. It's our June report, our mid-year report. That's based primarily on what we saw in the Government Stability Programme update that has been published back in April. So I presume at this stage many of us are familiar with the background and context to the Fiscal Council. We've been around since July 2011, put on a statutory footing in 2012. There's 5 members of the council with a staff of 7, and we generated this fiscal assessment report twice a year. So with this one based on the Stability Programme update, and our second one in November based primarily on what we see in the budget. So it's through the budgetary cycle as we progress through the year. Our mandate consists of 4 elements: to assess and also endorse the macroeconomic forecast. So prior to the publication of the SPU, we'll have gone through with the Department of Finance their macroeconomic forecasts and offered our endorsement, and our latest report assesses them. We monitor the fiscal rules, both the domestic and EU fiscal rules, and we also then assess the fiscal stance within which the assessment of the fiscal rules feed into, but it's a bit more of a broader assessment of the economy and the role and position of fiscal policy within that. So we take our latest report, what are the key messages as we hit the midpoint of 2019. Well, the view is that the government should be cautious and stick to its plans as set out in SPU 2019. So we've looked at these numbers, and maybe as with previous years, we're looking at a plan that, as set out, could be deemed to be appropriate, and is one that could be considered cautious. The economy is strong, but the outlook is uncertain, meaning that things could go very strong domestically, or of course we have external factors that could cause a drag on the economy. And within the public finances there still are significant risks, and spending has been allowed to drift upwards, and particularly as we'll see, the growth rate of spending has drifted upwards in recent years beyond planned increases. So looking at the economy, as I said, that the growth has been strong for the past 5 or 6 years. We've probably gone beyond the recovery phase in the economy as the unemployment rate has continued to decline. But as we say, the outlook is unusually uncertain. The government's forecast is when the UK makes an orderly and agreed exit from the EU at the end of 2020. So they assume that the withdrawal agreement is implemented at some stage, and that a hard Brexit is avoided, and that a transition phase is in play until the end of 2020. And then we have the domestic considerations, where sort of domestic demand and domestic output continue to rise as it has for the last number of years. If we look at the public finances, I suppose at first we have to acknowledge the huge improvement there has been in the public finances since a huge deficit opened up in 2008, 2009. But we exited the excessive deficit procedure in 2015. And since then, even though the economy has been performing strongly, even though there have been significant boosts to the public finances, there's been little progress in improving Ireland's deficit ratios since 2015. And in fact, our debt ratio, when measured in net debt terms, remains the 5th highest in the OECD. It looks particularly benign if you do it from a GDP perspective, but you actually do it from a more appropriate measure of income, you see we remain being the 6th highest. The government has allowed a pattern of spending drift in recent years. So policy spending growth has risen from 4.5% in 2015 to 6.7% in 2018. So we'll come what we mean by policy spending. It's looking at both sides of the ledger, looking at tax changes and spending changes. And of course we have the ongoing surge in corporation tax receipts that in a sense is masking some of the underlying deterioration we're seeing in the public finances. So CT receipts hit 10.4 billion last year. Right, there were less than 5 billion in 2014, and we've undertaken sort of various analysis of what they would be in a more normal scenario. Because of difficulties in actually understanding the CT receipts, it's hard to make comparisons about what they could or what they should be. But if you look at maybe the long-term average, look at the performance of the domestic economy, well, that suggests anything from 3 to 6 billion could be considered above conventional levels. And when it comes to a medium-term strategy out for 4 or 5 years, we continue to see no credible medium-term strategy, with constant revisions to budgetary ceilings and projections made out for the latter years based on technical assumptions that mightn't really be based on policy and outcomes. We do think the government should stick to the plans as set out in SPU 2019 in looking at what can happen this year and next year. This reflects the risk of a hard Brexit, the continued and maybe increasing reliance on corporation tax, possibilities of overheating the domestic economy, and the rapid rise in spending we've seen between 2017 and 2019. For this year, it means there should be no additional within-year increases without offsetting measures. So if there are to be overruns in various departments, as we've seen particularly in the case of health for the last number of years, these shouldn't be allow the aggregate to increase. But within a budget you can have moving parts, and if one part is going up, but then another part should come down. We also have the exclusion of the Christmas bonus for weekly social welfare recipients, that as of yet is still not included in the figures for 2019. I think we can all take it that that is going to happen. So again, it's possible we'll see this continuing drift in spending that we've seen over the last number of years happening again in 2019. For 2020, current plans entail some 2.8 billion of budgetary measures. So there still is scope there for fiscal change, although a lot of that has already been pre-committed, whether it's public capital spending, public sector pay, demographic pressures, and assumed tax cuts. So the possibility of announcing new measures without offsetting on either side is probably quite limited. So given the previous announcements and pre-commitments, this allows for minimal new tax and spending measures on budget day. So I think at this stage we're looking at maybe around 600 million of that 2.8 billion being available, and that's somewhere somewhere similar to where it would have been this time last year. Plans set out last year would have shown a budget day package allowable of around 800 million. So it's not entirely different to where we were this time last year. Of course, what we saw last year is that 800 million became 1.1 billion for 2019, and of course there was a significant overrun of spending for 2018. So the plans weren't A, adhered to, and B, they were changed. So if additional measures are to be taken, the government should introduce revenue raising measures or scale back spending or tax cuts elsewhere. So there is scope to introduce measures beyond that 600 million if you have spending cuts elsewhere or possible revenue increasing measures. So for the last number of years we have seen some revenue raising measures. So go back to 2018, you had the increase in stamp duty on commercial property, and of course for this year we have the restoration of the VAT rate in the hospitality sector. So for 2020, if additional measures are required, they could be funded by additional taxes. So even though for the last 2 years, 17 or 18 and 19, we've seen revenue raising measures, spending has risen beyond what even that would have allowed. So just looking at a bit more detail at the domestic economy, obviously we're all familiar with the huge problems that emerge in looking at Ireland's national account. So measuring economic growth isn't as straightforward as perhaps it might be in other countries. So maybe the cleanest measure of the economy comes from the labour market, just how many people are working. So all we have here is the annual growth rate in both total employment and full-time employment going back to 2012. So you can see the start of the recovery and a long sustained 3 to 4% growth rate in total employment over that period. So quite rapid growth. We've seen large increases in employment and significant reductions in unemployment, with the latest estimate putting the unemployment rate at around 4.5%, which is possibly what we could consider to be at full employment in Ireland, or perhaps even below it. And we see that at times full-time employment has been growing even faster. So maybe in the labour market there also is a couple of distortions, that as part-time workers have become full-time, as part-time roles have been replaced, full-time employment has actually been growing a bit faster and hit rates not seen since the late 1990s, during 2017 and 2018. We can try to extract various measures from the national accounts of growth and output. So like looking at the number of people working really only gives us sort of one view of what's happening. What is the value in terms of the output? So underlying domestic demand tries to look at spending in the economy, stripping out some of the complications that those who follow the Irish national accounts have seen. And you see that growing at 4.5%, 5% over the past number of years, and that growth perhaps even accelerating as you go through 2017. And then look at what households are spending and their consumption of goods and services. Again, we're seeing maybe with some volatility down to some measurement issues within the CSO's accounts, but quite strong growth beginning from 2013, 2014, growing 5%, some volatility recently, but a growth rate of 4% year-on-year terms is quite rapid. Will put us in the upper element of economic performance across possibly the EU and the OECD. But one consequence of that growth is those resources that were in the economy are beginning to be used up. So thankfully we've seen the unemployment rate drop, But can we maintain employment growth rates of 3.5%? Where are the workers going to come from? Do we have the resource capacity in the economy to continue at the projected levels of growth? And we have a measure of what we call the output gap, the difference between what we are producing and what we could produce. So it's a difficult measure to get a handle on, particularly for an open economy such as Ireland. But both the Fiscal Council and the Department of Finance have made improvements over the last number of years in trying to measure the output gap. And again, we welcome the publication by the Department of Finance of their own bespoke measures of the output gap, going beyond the technical or legal requirements of producing estimates based on the EU's approach. They now produce estimates based on their own approaches. And we can see during the crisis years, so a negative means there's surplus resources in the economy, 9, 10, 11, then the recovery. And as we get towards the current period, we see that the output gap is turning positive. That is an unemployment rate of 4.5% sustainable for Ireland? Is that a level of output that can be maintained? So there is potential overheating in the economy at present, and it's possible that it's even been underestimated. Of course, the unemployment figure has been revised since the Department of Finance did their last estimates, and output gaps themselves in good times tend to be underestimated. And we can all look back and see, well, a positive output gap should have been higher. So, like here, it signals clear problems in 2003, 4, 5, 6, an economy operating well above its potential. But that's in hindsight. If we were to go back and say, what were the estimates of the output gap then, it'd all been done around here. The fact that we're here at present could be perhaps taken as being sort of a minimum or a baseline for where the positive output gap could be. And it is the Department of Finance that is forecasting potential overheating in the economy if their growth rates come to pass over the next couple of years. And it's possible that that overheating could be even larger if domestic economy continues to expand and maybe expand a bit more rapidly, if construction output, particularly residential construction output, picks up faster than forecast. So you have the potential for that overheating to be even larger. Well, as we said, the outlook for the economy is unusual at present in that we have both significant upside risks and downside risks. And the downside risk could be various hard Brexit scenarios, and they could impact on output in Ireland. We've taken estimates from the ESRI and the Central Bank as to the impact a hard Brexit scenario could have on Ireland. So that prospect of overheating could be ameliorated quite quickly if a hard Brexit was to materialise. So hence, you do get this range between what can happen over the coming years. So then we look at the fiscal context. I suppose our key takeout here has been the acceleration in the growth of spending over the last number of years. So here we have data on a general government basis, so taking in all sectors of government, and looking at revenue, we see very strong revenue growth during the recovery. In part based on the cyclical recovery, all those people back at work, the payment of tax on their income, the spending, we've seen the consumption growth, the payment of consumption-based taxes, and very strong revenue growth, averaging maybe 5.5–6% over the years, because that's been buttressed by the surges in corporation tax we've seen, one in 2015 and then one again last year. But if you look at what's happening on the spending side, we see the non-interest spending, so primary spending, government spending on goods and services and capital spending. The growth has been accelerating to the end of the austerity years where spending was forcefully cut. But now we see a relaxation. In fact, for 2018, we see that even with that surge in corporation tax receipts, non-interest spending grew at a faster rate than revenue. So that revenue was boosted by a cyclical upturn with rates of growth that can't be sustained out over the medium term, and a potentially artificial boost to revenue from corporation tax. But even taking those into account, non-interest spending grew even faster. So hence we're looking at possible deterioration in the underlying public finance position if you take those concerns into account, the strength of the cyclical recovery and concerns about the sustainability of corporation tax. And regardless of how you measure it, there are various different ways of measuring government spending, where you do general government primary spending, where you do general government spending as a whole, or look at the more limited exchequer cash-based spending, you see this trend upwards in the growth of spending over the last number of years. And here we have an additional measure of net policy spending, which takes into account tax changes as well. So like a tax cut is using fiscal resources. It has a similar impact on the budgetary balance. So if you look at this net policy spending taking into account both tax and spending, you see it fell by more in 2009-10 when significant tax increases were introduced. So that's adding to fiscal resources. But you can see it trending upwards over the last number of years. In fact, even some of the tax cuts in 2015 and 2016, net policy spending was growing even faster than just a measure based on spending alone. So again, it's an indication of an increase, an acceleration in spending growth over the last number of years. So with the result that the primary balance, so if we strip out interest costs, and there are boosts to the public finances from interest costs as well, but we won't consider those just in this measure here. Just look at the primary balance, look at government revenues and government spending excluding interest costs. That has essentially been flat over the last 4 or 5 years. So even though strong cyclical recovery boosting revenue, very strong surges in corporation tax happening on occasion, the actual primary balance as a percentage of GNI star has been largely consistent and constant since 2015. So any money that's been coming in has been committed to fiscal measures either on the spending side or on the tax side. And in fact, if you were to take the cyclical position of the economy into consideration, and this assumes that all the corporation tax is in sort of economic activity, but look at the level of the economy and that potential for overheating, the fact that the economy may be performing above its potential, you actually see a deterioration in the fiscal position. That when times are good, we should be building up fiscal buffers or fiscal resources. But the fact that spending is matching revenue means those buffers aren't being built up, and the underlying fiscal position in structural terms is deteriorating, even with the support of these significant and somewhat uncertain corporation tax receipts. Part of this, and quite a significant part, is not necessarily due to budgetary plans being loose or lacking caution, has been down to the implementation of plans. That what we've seen in the various SPUs and budgets we've assessed, as we progress through various years, those plans aren't adhered to. So here we're just looking at within-year spending increases in the past couple of years. So the budgetary plans that are set out at the start of the year, can they be stuck to over the coming 12 months? These aren't medium-term forecasts. And these are forecasts set at the start of the year for the coming 12 months. So in 2015, there was €1 billion of within-year spending increases announced. 2016 and 2017 it fell a bit, but still 700 million and 500 million of spending increases announced. And then of course last year a far more significant amount, with 1.3 billion, which actually was a small bit higher than what they'd indicated by the time of the budget. Well, the budget was in October, they were 10 months into the year, and they were trying to predict what the overrun would be. Actually just rolled forward another 2.5 months, and the overrun was higher again. And we were critical of those overruns in November, but I would actually seen that, in fact, they didn't even stick to the budgetary figures. And on both an exchequer and particularly on a general government basis, additional spending was seen in the outturn data. And the issue with these spending increases is that they get built in, by and large, on current spending, the hiring of additional staff, the provision of additional services. They're done on a year-on-year basis. So it's not just a case of saying that these additional spending increases, you'd sum up these numbers to get the impact. They are in effect cumulative. That the additional spending here, the additional spending here, are all built on top of each other. So even though we have this large revenue growth, planned spending and unplanned spending is consuming an awful lot of it. If we look at Ireland's debt burden, it does appear to be coming down, but it's still at an elevated level. So this is putting Ireland's net debt burden as a share of GNI star. So I suppose the traditional method internationally would be gross debt as a percentage of GDP. We're doing neither here. With net debt, we're giving or allowing for some of the financial assets that the state owns. So the significant cash balances within the entity and their caution in terms of trying to maintain and ensure that Ireland has a sufficient stock of liquid assets if pressures were to build up in financial markets. It came to 2008 and 2009 when we couldn't borrow money. So we do give some allowance for the large assets, and of course then GDP isn't appropriate, so we use GNI star. And since peaking at around 120% in 2011, 2012, it has been on a downward trajectory. But even though that has happened, if we look at comparative measures across the OECD, our net debt using GNI stars is the 5th highest. So only Greece, Japan, Italy and Portugal have higher measures. So even though it's on a downward trajectory, and if you use GDP, it looks like we're achieving sort of mid-table anonymity, who'd focus on us. If financial markets were to look and say, well, is GDP the appropriate measure for Ireland? What's this GNI star they're talking about over there? And suddenly they'd see that we're off up here. So relatively benign conditions in financial markets could change if there was to be some turmoil in financial markets, perhaps maybe driven by developments in Italy, and we're not a million miles from them when it comes to our level of debt. The risks we've gone through, and as with previous reports, we tried to go through some of them in particular detail. So the two that stand out, of course, are corporation tax and the potential impact of a disorderly Brexit. And if you look at corporation tax and look at, as long as we have data for, going back to the early 1980s, and look at CT receipts as a share of exchequer tax revenue, for 2018 we have never been higher. So almost, we're just over 1 in 6, almost 1 in 5, every tax euro collected by the exchequer came through corporation tax. And that has never been higher. There was a peak in the early 2000s when we had a slightly higher rate, and maybe we had domestic companies, particularly banks, paying more corporation tax. We're now in a position in 2018 with a lower rate. The 12.5% rate is fully kicked in since the mid-2000s. And of course domestic companies, particularly the large companies, our banks, aren't paying significant amounts of corporation tax. So this 18.7% is even different to this, and it's perhaps presenting some additional risks. Those risks being the concentration, which useful data from the revenue commissioners now gives us some insight into. And we see that the top 10 companies in 2018 paid 45% of corporation tax. So even though we're very dependent in aggregate, like almost half of it is coming from just 10 companies. So it is a significant concentration risk. Now the revenue commissioners have been producing these numbers for a couple of years, and the share from the top 10% has remained sort of in that 40 to 45% range. But one thing they've shown is that the top 10 companies actually changes. So although there's a significant concentration risk, there does appear to be some movement, which may slightly ameliorate the concentration risk. That if one large company makes a lower payment, it does look like another large company is making a higher payment. So there is some movement within that top 10. We're not quite clear how much, but it's not the same 10 companies every year. But it's, the majority of them could be staying the same quite year. The next 90 companies pay a further 28%. So the top 100 are accounting for over 70% of corporation tax receipts. And then the remaining 55,000 themselves are contributing around a quarter. So it's a significant source of tax revenue for the state and a highly concentrated one, and really has risen for somewhat unexplained reasons for the last number of years. We've seen that surge in 2015, and again we saw a surge in 2018. And if you look at it relative to certain sort of baselines, so again we see the actual, that surge in 2015 and another surge in 2018. If you go back to 2015 and say, well, what plans were the government setting out in 2015 for corporation tax? And you can look at maybe projected CT receipts, that by 2018 they were projecting they'd be about 5 billion. Turns out they were more than 10 billion. In fact, if you go back and look at the same projections, they were projecting that interest costs would be 10 billion, and they turned out to be 5 billion. So rather than what they thought 5 years ago, we've had a 5 billion boost on the revenue side through corporation tax, and a 5 billion gain on the spending side through lower interest. But that hasn't translated into visible improvements in the balance. So all those resources, by and large, have been used. But if you look at that projection and say, well, given what has happened to the economy, or what the sort of average or conventional amount of corporation tax being collected has been, you could get a range from here to here and say, well, we actually had this significant outperformance, looking at what a very benign or positive scenario would have been back in 2014, 2015, to one that's maybe a bit more conservative. And you're looking at perhaps an outperformance of between 3 and 6 billion. But again, it's quite difficult to get a handle on it, given we don't know really what has caused the surge in corporation tax. It's paid by quite a small number of companies, and I think we can take it that almost all of those companies significantly contributing to corporation tax are foreign-owned companies, which maybe is an issue that sort of feeds into the domestic economy. That this money is coming from abroad through the government accounts and is going out into the economy. It's a stimulus to the economy. In general, with tax revenue, it's taken out of the sort of domestic economy. More income tax or more VAT is taken out of our pockets. If the government spends it, it's a bit of a circle. Like with this corporation tax, that's coming from foreign companies. So it's not coming out of the pockets in the domestic economy, it's coming out of foreign shareholders, and being spent is adding to demand in the economy. So the model projections that some 3 to 6 billion of the annual receipts as of 2018, and they've got to 10 billion, are unexplained by the domestic economy. So official forecast would have put it at 5 billion, which obviously is 5 billion lower than where we ended up. So assuming a return to the long run share of tax receipts, corporation tax would fall by 3.5 billion. So that 18.4% peak, if that just went back to the long run average, that would get us a reduction of 3.5 billion. And if Ireland returns to EU norms for taxable corporate profits against gross value added, it would imply excess receipts in the region of 3.5 to 4.3 billion. So again, look at maybe additional profits being located in Ireland for one reason or other. So looking at these corporation tax receipts, there has been various talk over the last number of years of what should be done with them. And by and large, given the uncertain nature of them and the fact that they're being used to mask spending increases, something needs to be done. So there's been proposals from political parties, there have been murmurings of proposals from the Department of Finance. We have seen issues surrounding a rainy day fund. But the Council in its latest report recommends a prudence account, where you take the forecast of corporation tax receipts for the year, you say that, what's your benchmark, your starting point, and then if CT comes in ahead of that, any of those excess receipts are taken from the exchequer account and put into a prudence account. So they would be counted as spending from the exchequer account. They wouldn't be allowed to remain there if receipts go above the level set out at the start of the year. And that's what we've seen for the last number of years, that this outperformance in CT has happened, but it's basically been used to mask these spending overruns and cover with in-year policy announcements. So if this was to happen, you'd see contributions to the prudence account made every year, where these excess or surprise CT receipts aren't included in the are left to remain in the exchequer account. And then at the end of December, you probably have an amount of money left, and they could be contributed to a rainy day fund or put into sort of alternative liquidity management strategies by the NTMA, but aren't used to mask these in-year spending increases we've seen over the more recent years. As I said, the Department's projections assume an orderly Brexit, that the withdrawal agreement is passed due to this transition period to the end of 2020, and the maybe impact of Ireland, while there, isn't as significant as with a hard Brexit. So various research bodies around have done hard Brexit scenarios. The ESRI and the central bank, we've essentially just taken their estimates of what a hard Brexit scenario could have on Irish GDP growth. Again, there's a whole uncertainty about timing, but the key point here is the difference it makes between the baseline forecasts of the Department of Finance, and if a hard Brexit was to happen at some stage, you get a dramatically lower Irish growth rate. Again, there's some timing uncertainty, but the scale of the gaps there and the impact on the economy here are quite significant. So we have the baseline and then significant potential movement around that. And one impact on that could be on this declining debt ratio we're seeing. maybe if you are to have a hard Brexit, and it was to lead to a slowdown or even a reduction of economic activity in Ireland, that would have an impact on government revenues, also have an impact on the expenditure side. We might see a deficit open up, and then the debt ratio, which is forecast to be on a downward trajectory, could be even flat or maybe even start to edge up. And of course, one issue with this is, how would you respond to that? So with the budget balance, the baseline is a very, very benign, in fact positive. So small surplus this year. Take the SPU, you're looking at relatively large surpluses by 2023, although we don't think those medium-term plans are credible for a variety of reasons. If a hard Brexit in the ESRI scenario was to arise, the deficit would be much larger, particularly if it happens in the near years, and the same for the Central Bank of Ireland. Impact on the debt ratios and the funding requirements that the NTMA would have to raise to roll over existing debt and to fund these potentially quite large deficits in these years. So this could present a policy choice. Like, what happens if a hard Brexit was to occur? So a more benign Brexit might suggest policy should allow small rise in the debt ratio with limited efforts to stabilise the debt path, i.e. just allow it to happen, allow automatic stabilisers to provide a sort of a stabilising effect for the economy. That if you have an increase in unemployment, allow unemployment spending to rise. If you have a reduction in employment that drags down tax revenues, well then just absorb it through higher deficits for a number of years, and then have a cyclical recovery over a period to close that deficit and put the debt ratio back in a downward trajectory. However, a disorderly Brexit and a hard Brexit would have a much more severe consequences for the economy, and the trade-offs would be far worse. Maybe we couldn't allow those, or wouldn't be able to allow those automatic stabilisers just to evolve naturally. So the government might need to cut spending or raise taxes to prevent debt ratios from rising indefinitely. If the deficit becomes too large, and maybe higher funding costs, higher interest costs, maybe higher interest rates, might actually see a return to a need to have spending cuts or raise taxes. Of course, one way to ameliorate that risk is to have the fiscal space available now, to generate the capacity to absorb the potential impact of a hard Brexit. But if we continue to use the resources as we are unnecessarily vulnerable to the potential impact of a disorderly Brexit. And these sort of undesirable choices are something that we could be faced with again. So should a more adverse shock materialise, policy responsibility to be carefully assessed. However, the government should in principle act to support the economy as much as possible during any period of unusually weak demand. But you have to have the resources and the capacity to do so. If you want to run a deficit to support the economy, you need to have somebody to lend to you. When looking at the fiscal stance, so for 2019 the government should stick to the plan. So if there are to be overruns in certain areas, we're not looking for every line item in the budget to hit the exact amounts allowed at the start of the year. Some things can be over, some things can be under, but in aggregate terms there should be no additional within-year increases without offsetting measures. So if one area has to get more resources, there should be gains or efficiency improvements elsewhere to allow that to happen. So the plan stance for 2019 was an expansion in line with sustainable growth and inflationary pressures. So in line with a long-run sustainable growth rate of the economy and estimates of inflation. But of course the government ramped up spending beyond that. So for 2018, after we had the Stability Programme update and the Summary Economic Statement, it increased spending beyond, or by 1.3 billion beyond the potential or a planned 3.2 billion. This occurred largely in health. And as we said, in addition, the budget package for 2019 went from 800 million to 1.1 billion. So much of these unplanned increases were masked by possibly temporary surge in corporation tax receipts. So it looks like a modest surplus was run for 2018. I think the CSO, when they published the figures, showed a surplus of 46 million. That's the amount of money the HSE spends in a day. And any further unexpected corporation tax receipts should be allocated to a prudence account to stem reliance and not have the ability to mask unplanned increases in spending that may or may not arise. So for 2020, the government should be cautious with its budget. So this reflects the risks we've been announcing in both directions. Like the risks in both directions actually would point to similar advice for the fiscal stance. So this reflects the hard Brexit, reliance on corporation tax, overheating risks, and the rapid spending rise we've seen over the last number of years. So we don't need a case of excess use of fiscal resources now, given the economy is performing so strongly, and two, given the potential risks over the medium term. So to limit the possibility of rising debt ratios, lost creditworthiness, and a need for a sizable correction of public finances, the government should stick to its plans in SPU 2019, so allowing for support to be provided in the event of an adverse shock. So like the sustainable growth rate is probably a bit below where we are now. So the public accounts and exchequer tax revenues should rise in line with the cyclical recovery we're seeing, if you maintain the use of resources to a sustainable long-run growth rate. It's probably in the region of 3–3.5% increase in output in the Irish economy. Like I said, we've been seeing growth rates maybe of 5% for the last number of years. When you put it in line with the sustainable medium-term growth rate, add a bit for inflation, you're looking at what should be sustainable increases. And that appropriate fiscal stance would allow the fiscal resource to be built up in good times. The strong performance we're seeing now would allow the building up of fiscal resources for use if there was to be a drop in corporation tax receipts, or there was to be a very hard Brexit impacting the economy and the public finances. So for 2020, in the budget the government will have in October, sticking to the SPU plans would entail some 2.8 billion of budgetary measures for 2020. So there still is a significant expansion allowable in the provision of services within the budget through a 2.8 billion increase as set out in the government's own figures at present. So this amounts to already earmarked for increases in public investment, public sector pay agreements, demographic pressures in education, health, social welfare, and assumed tax cuts for 2020. So this will allow minimum new tax and spending measures on budget day, taking into account previous announcements. So they said we're probably looking at somewhere around 600 million being available under existing plans. And like, given the risks that are there, like, there are arguments that can be made that the public finances should improve by more than set out in SPU 2019. You can make a strong case based on the size of the risks we face, the impending nature of Brexit, the fact that corporation tax have grown to such heights, that improving the public balance by more than set out in plans would be desirable. And of course we've seen slippage for the last number of years. And in 2017 and 18 we have seen the government exceed spending limits as set out by the expenditure benchmark. So if they had adhered to those spending limits, we would be in a better position now. So in fact, just allowing spending to increase at close to the amount allowable under sustainable growth rates for the economy plus inflation is maybe underestimating the risks we face and not taking fully into consideration the slippage we've seen in recent years. If the government is to go beyond the 600 million, it's perfectly entitled to do so, but they should be funded by revenue raising measures to preserve overall sustainability or by scaling back planned spending increases and tax cuts elsewhere. So we're looking at a net 600 million. And within that, if you have revenue raising measures and they provide a sustainable source of revenue, that can be used to fund spending. And if on the other side, if you wish to cut taxes, you can do that by reducing permanent spending elsewhere. That would allow you further space to cut taxes. So it's not limiting the choices the government has to make, but it's putting the legitimate view that the public finances should be on a sustainable fashion. We can't expect to do everything. If we look out over the medium term, it's a common refrain from us, but the government's medium term plans are not credible. So beyond the current year and the following year, from 2021 onwards, the projections show surpluses increasing in every year, but the spending forecasts underpinning these projections are not credible. So in fact, when we get to 2023, there are quite large surpluses there, and they're not based on any firm policy commitments to adhere to those, but are based on technical assumptions about future spending. So they imply an implausible slowdown in spending growth. So this acceleration we've seen over previous years is supposed to slow down in 2020, 2021, which do not reflect likely future policies or the future cost of meeting existing commitments. Even demographic pressures will probably consume almost all of the planned increase in spending in the medium-term plans. So the government needs a credible medium-term strategy, looking out not just 1 year, but over 2, 3, 4 years, with departmental expenditure ceilings that mean a bit more than what they mean at present, with constant upward provisions. So a better element of budgetary planning could be built around 4 elements. So one would be a debt target. So we had one 12, 18 months ago. Wasn't clearly specified, but has been dropped in recent years. So a well-specified debt target would possibly provide an anchor to government policy. Then a speed limit would be to stick to sustainable growth rates for spending, not making decisions perhaps based on temporary or transitory revenue, either because of very strong cyclical upturn in the economy or the unpredictable nature of corporation tax. Then departmental and ministerial ceilings should be set in a multi-year context where actually changing them becomes something significant. In fact, most people are probably unaware that we have a system of 3-year departmental ceilings at present, because they're revised on such a basis that they are not a restriction on policy. And because expenditure ceilings, both even within a year and over a multi-year period, tend to be revised, they lose credibility. So if those who are managing spending see the ceilings being upwardly revised, it provides less of an incentive or willingness to adhere to those ceilings. So it becomes a soft and perhaps a negligible or non-existent budgetary constraint. And then the budgetary positions become reliant on corporation tax, and these excess receipts could be removed from the budgetary arithmetic through the use of something called or approaching a prudence account, or you would call it a spending, but have it set aside maybe for contribution to a rainy day fund when we may need to boost the domestic economy, or in just the liquidity management of the MTMA. If you look at Ireland's fiscal policy over a quarter of a century, going back to the mid-1990s, we have a new chart in our report, this time but it's been used elsewhere before, looking at the level of economic conditions in the economy, the output gap across here, and then what's happening to the public finances. So is the government adding or taking money out of the economy? We don't need to go through the technicalities of it, but if fiscal policy was to be counter-cyclical, if it was the following approach of taking money out when the economy doesn't need it and putting it in when it does, well, by and large these dots should go in this direction here. So in expansion and economic bad times, the government spending more to provide a boost to the economy. A consolidation, taking money out in good times. So if counter-cyclical policy was in this direction here, this is what we've done. So fiscal policy has clearly been pro-cyclical, cutting taxes and increasing spending when the resources became available because the economy was performing quite well, and then of course doing the opposite when the economy is performing poorly. Because the revenues weren't there, increasing taxes and cutting spending in bad times. So exacerbating the economic cycle, making downturns worse, and adding fuel to economic expansions. So there's a heightened pro-cyclicality of Irish fiscal policy, and it's not clear that we've broken that cycle. And it could be that the pro-cyclicality of current fiscal policy could be understated. Maybe we're not correctly estimating the output gap, maybe it should be higher. And are we reflecting the fact that these corporation tax receipts are coming from foreign-owned companies? So pumping that into the economy might be adding an additional stimulus to the economy. So to recap the key messages across our latest report, the government should be cautious, and we view cautious as means sticking to the plans as set out in SPU 2019. And if they adhere to that, it would be assessed to be in line with good budgetary management. And as I said, there are arguments that can be made that even greater caution should be exercised given the level of risks we face. Growth is strong, but the outlook for the economy is unusually uncertain, and that we're pointing to very significant risks, but they're actually in both directions. The domestic economy continues to to grow quite dramatically, driven by household spending, investment in property, etc. And that could continue, but a hard Brexit or a slowdown in international trade, increased tensions, or changes in international taxation, all could present downside risks. And the public finances remain vulnerable. So high debt and dependence on corporation tax. And spending has been allowed to drift upwards in recent years, with an acceleration in spending increase beyond planned increases. That's where we stand for the June 2019 Fiscal Assessment Report of IFAC.